There we go. All right. Let's get started. So, good night, or good evening, everyone, I should say. We have a few people here in the library viewing with us, and we have many of you joining via Zoom with us this evening. So welcome. Thank you for being here. We are very excited this evening. The Peters Township Public Library is very pleased to welcome this evening Dr. Glenn Sterner, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the Pennsylvania State University, Abington Campus. As an expert on substance abuse use issues, Dr. Sterner is an appointed member of the Opioid Task Force for the state of Pennsylvania. Sorry, that was a lot to say. Before we begin, I'd just like to say a few brief words on how this program came to be. Dr. Sterner knows this. This is how I found him to begin with. As many of you know, in just a few weeks, the Peters Township Library Foundation will be holding its annual Novel November author event. This year, the foundation has brought in best-selling nonfiction author Patrick Radden-Keefe, journalist, investigative reporter, and contributor for the New Yorker magazine. Among his many works is a book called Empire of Pain, which is about the Sackler family and their contribution to the epidemic that we are in right now. It was an amazing, I will say this, we're not normally giving our opinions, but it was an amazing, infuriating, and heartbreaking book to read. And it did send me down a rabbit hole of wanting to learn more about the opioid crisis because it's such an important topic right now. So I watched, listened, and read endlessly and was just truly astounded about how many people are affected by opioid addiction. Wanting to have a program that was related to this subject, and everything I kept finding how close-hearted it was hit, especially in rural areas of Pennsylvania, I was led right to Dr. Sterner, whose many works are helping to educate and to destigmatize this crisis that's facing so many in our community and beyond, all over the country, really. If you would like to read up more on this subject, Dr. Sterner has provided a wonderful list of book titles, many of which were that rabbit hole I went down. For those of you here in the library or those of you watching who want to come to the library, those books are on display in our lobby. And we will actually send a list of those books after, when we send the recording, we'll send along the list of the book titles as well. Also, I'm just going to do a little blurb too. If you would like to actually read Empire of Pain or learn any more about our Novel November event, Patrick Radden-Keefe, buy tickets, all those things, that information is available on our website at ptlibrary.org. I would also like to say for everybody here and everybody watching us on Zoom, this program is going to be recorded, just so you know. And Dr. Sterner is kind enough to take questions and answers, do a Q&A portion of this throughout the program. And for those of you here in attendance this evening, if you'd like to ask a question, just let me know and I'm happy to pass that on to Dr. Sterner as well. With all that being said, like I said, we're so pleased to have Dr. Sterner with us this evening, and I'm going to turn that over to him. So Dr. Sterner, welcome. It's all yours.
Fantastic. Danielle, thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm incredibly honored. When you reached out to, ask me to come over and speak with you all, it's one of those things where you do these presentations and you do this work, and when people find you, I find that to be really, frankly, humbling. And so I'm really excited to be here. And because, like you said, this is a topic that is so incredibly important. It's something that I talk about all over the country, all over the world about, and it's really something that originates right where you all are right now. And so Washington County is known as one of the counties in Pennsylvania that has traditionally been at the heart and epicenter of the opioid crisis. And now we know that this is something that is burgeoning to other issues. But what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit more about like the realities of what that looks like, right? Like we hear these words, we hear opioids, we hear drugs, we hear these issues facing our communities. And they can be a little scary. And so what I'm hoping to do is hopefully, frankly, provide a little bit of information so that it isn't as scary anymore, but also for us to really be thinking about what this means and looks like in our communities and our homes and our families. and what it is that we can do together to hopefully address these issues. And so I'm going to just preface the chat that we're going to have tonight with a couple things. First, I know that this is a really heavy topic and that this is something that is really serious, and it can sometimes be something that affects a lot of people. I know many people across the audiences that I talk to that have been affected by opioid use disorder and opioid use and overdose in various ways, whether that's you yourself have lived experience, whether that's you have a loved one you might have lost, or you might be maybe questioning whether or not you need some help right now. So if you need to take a minute, pause, step away, that's okay. I'm completely okay with that. I really welcome that, so that you have that space to be able to do so. The other thing is that if you have questions along the way, I'm happy to take them. We're going to have about like 4 sections or so. So I'll probably try to keep those questions and answer to those 4 sections. I'll give us a pause. We'll be able to have some conversations and some questions answered during those times. And then at the very end, we'll have some more opportunities. So if you find that you have more questions that you just would like some answers to, we can certainly explore those together. So just know that all that is going to occur in the next roughly hour or so. And then we've got about, like I think Danielle mentioned that we have about a half an hour for question and answer and discussions afterwards. So I'm happy to be a resource for you now as well as into the future. So just know that. I'm going to share my screen right now. I've got a presentation that I'm going to share with you because I think sometimes that's helpful in order for us to understand some of the numbers, the data, the information that's presented, rather than just looking at my face. And so, we titled this discussion, How the Opioid Epidemic and Other Substances Are Impacting Pennsylvania Communities, and What You Can Do to Help Address These Issues. And so just by way of further introduction, I am an associate professor of criminal justice at Penn State. I'm associated with both our Criminal Justice Research Center and our Consortium on Substance Use and Addiction. Penn State is a system. We have campuses that span across the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and we also have our extension entity that helps to reach every single community across the Commonwealth. And if you ever need any assistance from Penn State, particularly around this issue or any other issue, you can always feel free to reach out to me, and I'm hoping that we can get you connected into anybody who might be able to help you with the issues that you're facing. So feel free to make sure that you know that we are always a resource. But what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about substance use and substance use disorders. And so I think sometimes those things can be a little confusing. So we're going to clarify some of those. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the United States and Pennsylvania and Washington County specifically, so that you can kind of get an understanding of how these issues are facing our communities. We're going to also talk a little bit about some of these things that are kind of new. I call them emerging substance use issues. But what's coming up? What are we hearing from our colleagues in other locations and settings that might be of help to you, just so that you can be aware? And then, frankly, we're going to talk a little bit about what it is that you can do to help along this line. But one of the things that I think is also important is that I'm not a person with lived experience. I don't have experience personally with substance use disorder, and I haven't really lost anyone specifically in my family associated with this. But I have talked with literally hundreds of people across the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and beyond, both those who are in recovery, those who have lost a loved one, those ones who have supported loved ones through their process of recovery. And sometimes it's more effective for you to hear from one of those folks. And so I'm going to share with you the story that Rich is going to tell you in just a minute. Rich is actually from close to you all. I got to connect with Rich. He's now unfortunately passed on, but he and his family had a loved one that they lost in their family. And so just know that this is going to be a bit of a serious issue. And so if this is something that can cause issues for you, just know that it's okay to step away during this time. But I'm going to let Rich talk to you about his experience.
This beautiful child, this gifted athlete, this brilliant academic person who had his whole life in front of him. And here he is lying motionless, dead. My name is Rich Levitt, and this is my story. We were a great family. We did everything together. However, we did not have the knowledge of what the opioid crisis was. As a young boy, Jonathan had a thirst for knowledge and reading. He just had a passion for hockey, and he developed into a tremendous athlete, as well as a tremendous scholar. At age 16, he had a virus, and we took him to a hospital. and they treated him with a 2-week supply of Oxycontin. And we believe that's when his brain began to get hijacked. Pills missing from the medicine cabinet. His sleeping habits were different. There were mood swings. I look back now, that was the beginning. It took a long time before my son started to tell the truth. Because when your brain gets hijacked with opioids, lie becomes another lie. My daughter Lauren went to Kent. Jonathan went to St. John's. They both had scholarships. He flunked out of college, and then he flunked out of our local community college. He was going to school, sitting in his car, getting high, setting his phone to ring at 3 o'clock, come home, and I would ask, how's school? And he would go, fine. Until after grades came out, when we found out that he never went to school. He would cry on our laps, I hate this disease, I need help. Jonathan did get into rehab, and he did well, and so he came home in December of 2016. The family time started to become very, very special, and this is a good sign. And it was now Thursday, February 9th. I fell asleep about 9:30. I was exhausted because I tried to stay up with him. I just couldn't that night. I woke up at 2:35 in the morning, and I looked for Jonathan, and he wasn't in his room, but his light was on. And when Jonathan moved back to Pittsburgh, we set up a little man cave for him. So I went down there, and I found him from the waist down, laying on the couch, and the waist up, he just rolled over, and the top of his head was on the floor, and he wasn't moving. And out of his mouth, there was bile and blood, and we did mouth to mouth, and we did chest compressions. We did Narcan. We had first responders here within 3 minutes, and then took him to the hospital. 3:45, 4 o'clock in the morning. And I asked the nurse, I said, just please tell me, is my son alive? And she said, I'm so sorry. I talked to kids in many schools, public schools, private schools, inner city schools. I'm not wearing a suit and tie. I go in sneakers and shorts, and I go as a parent with a broken heart. I tell them Jonathan's story, and I tell the parents, bring it right to the dinner table and talk to them face to face. Talk to them about stigma, because the chances are you will know someone who has gone through an overdose or an overdose death. Work with law enforcement. Learn more about this disease. Help them, love them, support them. If we do all these things, we can save some lives. We can save some lives.
So, Jonathan's story is tragic, and so is Richard's. And his whole family continues to grieve for his loss. But Rich, all the way up to the end of, up until his own personal death, was out there taking his grief and taking his experience and helping to educate others. And so one of the things that I like to make sure that I talk about when I share Rich's story is that for him in that experience, it was obviously very traumatic, but what he was also doing is he was taking his experience and finding ways to help and reach out to others and support others in his community so that they again know about the warning signs and the issues, hopefully a little bit earlier maybe than what Rich and his family experienced with Jonathan. And so that's what I'm hoping that we can kind of get out of today as well. And so in order for us to do though, we have to, I think, talk a little bit more about what we'll call substance use and substance use disorders, because those are different things. And most people tend to lump those two together. I'm going to share just a quick video that helps to maybe share a little bit more about the information.
Does use of alcohol or drugs ever seem out of control for you or a loved one? Has it ever seemed like the line between fun and dysfunction is unclear? About 60% of Americans aged 12 and older currently use alcohol or drugs. For some, this use can become an addiction, or what we call substance use disorder, or an SUD. An SUD involves out-of-control use of a substance even though it causes you harm. People with an SUD become focused on using the substance to the point where they have problems with day-to-day functioning. People
Oops, sorry, hit a button.
Does use of alcohol or drugs ever seem out of control for you or a loved one? Has it ever seemed like the line between fun and dysfunction is unclear? About 60% of Americans aged 12 and older currently use alcohol or drugs. For some, this use can become an addiction, or what we call substance use disorder, or an SUD. An SUD involves out-of-control use of a substance even though it causes you harm. People with an SUD become focused on using the substance to the point where they have problems with day-to-day functioning. People with serious SUD will continue to use substances, even when they know it is causing or can cause harm. Heavy substance use directly impacts the body and mind, and can affect parts of the brain that control how you think, make decisions, learn, remember, and control your behavior. How can I help someone struggling with substance use disorders? Learn all you can, speak up, and offer constructive support. And don't wait for them to hit bottom. Substance use disorders are treatable and recovery is possible. For more information on substance use disorders, including treatment options, please visit www.psychiatry.org.
So that helps us give a little bit of an understanding of the spectrum of substance use and substance use disorders. So to clarify, substance use is really what we call recreational use, or it refers to the use of selected substances, including alcohol, tobacco products, drugs, inhalants, and other substances that can be consumed, inhaled, injected, or otherwise absorbed into the body with possible dependence and other detrimental effects. So real quick, those individuals who utilize substances recreationally or for medicinal purposes do not always end up into what we consider a substance use disorder. It's actually quite very few. But for those that do, those experiences can be, frankly, very detrimental. And when we think about substance use disorder, we also think about it almost as if like you're either using recreationally or you have an addiction. And that's also maybe a little bit of a misconception. And so when we think about substance use disorder, there are a whole host of symptoms that we know from the American Psychological Association that helps us to diagnose these things. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a medical doctor. I do not diagnose individuals, nor should you. And that's what we want to make sure that we also talk about, is that if you are noticing some of these issues, and frankly, the earlier the better, connecting them to someone who might be able to discuss these issues with that person is going to be really, really important, because sometimes that person may not always be your family physician, and it might not be your primary care physician. It might have to be somebody that with specialized training in either substance use disorder, addiction treatment, addiction medicine, pain management even. Because what they can do is they work through, there are tests to talk through this issue with that person to really see if this is an issue that's facing them. But here are some of the warning signs, including craving, spending a lot of time to obtain, use, or recover from use, giving up important activities because of using. And this spans from alcohol all the way to illicit substances like opioids. And so we recognize that severity is on a scale. So roughly, fewer than 2 symptoms, there's really no disorder, but you might want to just talk to them about, that there are some issues here that are starting to present. Because if you start to notice that those severities and those symptoms grow over time, then it might be an indication that their use might be becoming problematic, and you will certainly want to make sure that you're connecting them to treatment providers and individuals who can, again, make sure that they're connecting into those things to hopefully mitigate these issues, to stem these issues as early as possible. Because if we wait all the way to the end, then in those really severe experiences when we are now in full-blown addiction, it can sometimes be a little bit harder for that person to then move into a lifetime of recovery. The earlier you get people into treatment, the earlier you connect them to assistance, the more likely it is that they're going to be somebody who will be able to get into recovery quicker, faster, and sustain that recovery over time. I'll also note, though, that recovery looks different for different people. Sometimes that means that you can go into one recovery treatment program and that treatment program works. But just like what we know with other conditions, that not every single treatment is going to work for you the first time. And so that sometimes means that you try one treatment and that doesn't work. And then the second treatment, it might not work. The third treatment, it might work. And so the more that you get people into these various treatment mechanisms to make sure that they can address the issues associated with their substance use disorder, and make sure that you recognize that it might take more than one time, that reality can sometimes help you as somebody who is supporting them to not, frankly, get disillusioned or get disappointed or get depressed around some of the issues that you might be facing with the disruption that comes from a substance use disorder. Because one of the things that I think that we don't necessarily always realize is that while substance use disorder is an individual disease, it is frankly something that disrupts an entire family, and it can disrupt an entire community, as we've seen not just in Washington County, but frankly across the entire country. And so the more that we help to understand some of these issues, that it takes time, and it will take time to get people into a long-term sustained recovery, stepping by them, holding their hands, following up, making sure that we support them along the way is going to be incredibly important. If you are looking for specific treatment options, we have the Pennsylvania Department of Drug and Alcohol programs at the state level. In every single county has access to what's called a single county authority. This is the Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs website. You can use this QR code directly to get there. And they have a host of different resources, from treatment all the way to thinking about how it is that you can get into recovery support services. In addition, SAMHSA was what it's called, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have what's called the Treatment Finder. So you can find treatment.gov, use this QR code, and you can get connected to treatment. And what's also really great is that Pennsylvania is now using it's called the Treatment Atlas for Finding Treatment. It's a little redundant, but the Atlas provides, this is provided through Shadowproof, a national organization that addresses substance use and addiction-related issues across the country. But what we're now utilizing here in Pennsylvania is this gets you access to treatment facilities locally, as well as across the entire state and beyond. So I highly recommend that you check out both the treatmentatlas.org site, but also if you're interested in understanding issues associated with substance use and addiction more broadly, frankly, the folks at Shadowproof are really great. And if you know no other number or no other resource, make sure that you remember this. 988, just like 911, but 988 is now national. It is a hotline for mental health and substance use disorder crises, or it's just for you to get connected to resources that you need. So if you are finding that you have someone who you might suspect, or you yourself might have issues with substances, no matter what it is, or some other mental health related issue, 988. Call that number. They will get you connected to resources all the way down to the local level to make sure that you can get the help that you need. So with that being said, that was a lot of information so far. What I want to do is maybe take a moment and ask if there are any questions. I'm going to just stop my share real quick so that we can just chat. And if you have any questions right now, happy to take those questions. I was just noting that Brianne is over here putting up some information in the chat. And Brianne, thanks again for being on the call and also for sharing this information. She works for the Washington Drug and Alcohol Commission. They also serve as the single county authority for Washington County, and her information is all there. Again, I can't tell you how much the single county authority is just a fantastic resource, and I know that the folks here in Washington County specifically are the pinnacle of success. Frankly, when we talk about some of the folks across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania doing some really great work, we point to Washington County. Kathy asked a question. Are there posters we can post in our church with all of this info? There are actual posters that are available on the SAMHSA website. So if you go to that location, they have really great posters of all the same types of information, both for publicizing the national hotline, as well as some other issues associated with substance use. And if you go to that video, that's the Psychiatric Association, they also have some really great flyers that you can post as well. Any other questions, either online or in the room? Fantastic. Let's keep going. So I'm going to go back and share my screen. So what I want to talk a little bit more about is some of the trends. So it's important for us to make sure that we're at least aware of what's going on across not just our location, but further across the country. So I'm going to talk about the United States first, then I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania, and then I'm going to talk specifically about Washington County and what's going on down in your area of the state. You know, Danielle mentioned some of the really great resources and some of the great books that are available for you all to read. And it helps to give a little bit of context around the opioid crisis. And I don't even now like to use the term opioid crisis because it's moved so much beyond opioids with regards to the issues facing us in our communities that it's more along the lines of a polysubstance use issue that is facing us. Not opioids, but many substances are something that we need to be aware of. But just a little bit of history. So in the 1990s or so, that's when we really started to see and understand some of these issues associated with what we call the opioid crisis. That's when, as we mentioned before, the Sackler family and other companies, including Purdue, Mallinckrodt, a whole host of companies, AmerisourceBergen, were selling and distributing opioids, prescription opioid painkillers, to patients through physicians, and indicating that these were substances that were safe, that they were not have any options for becoming addictive or dependent, that they were completely okay to manage pain. And what we now know is that they were lying, and they were doing that in ways that were frankly unethical and illegal. And now we're holding them accountable by levying lawsuits, both from the state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but across the entire country. And so we're working through those things to make sure that we can hold them accountable accordingly. And they are still in process, by the way. But from roughly about 1999 to 2010, most of these overdoses were associated with prescription opioid painkillers. So this little blue line here is on the top from 1999 to, like I said, right around 2010 to 2015. Those are prescription opioid painkillers. And then all of a sudden, we started to see a shift. And so you'll see in 2011, this other blue line kind of pop up here. And that was where we started to see heroin really pop up in our communities. And what is a really great book to understand how that transition occurred is Sam Quinones' Dreamland. He went through and he helps us to understand how cartels and what we call international drug organizations, these what we would consider companies, really these illicit companies, selling these drugs into our communities. And what they did was they went to places where they saw these trends occurring as well. They saw where prescription opioids were being overloaded into communities, where people were clearly having some dependence issues. And they went to places where there were a lot of competition. So it wasn't in places that you would traditionally think of, like these very large urban centers. It was smaller urban places. Frankly, it's places like Washington County and other places associated with Ohio and West Virginia. That's where they really found a market for their heroin, because frankly, they could get it there cheaper. And as people were becoming either being identified through their physicians or through what we now call the prescription drug monitoring program, that doesn't allow you to go from physician to physician or pharmacy to pharmacy to get access to prescription opioid painkillers. They had to find some way in order to make sure that they were meeting their needs of their dependency issues. And so they turned, unfortunately, to illicit drugs, and in many cases that moved from prescription opioid painkillers that were sold illicitly, because those were really expensive, to what we now know as heroin. And so in that process, you could, instead of paying, say, $30 to $60 per pill in some cases, you could then get one dose of heroin for roughly $5. And you can imagine that was incredibly attractive to people. And that's what really drove the opioid crisis to, again, grow over time. But during that time, we saw this infiltration of what we now know as synthetic opioids, or what you might more colloquially know it as specifically fentanyl, but there's multiple types of synthetic opioids. And so 2013, 2014, we start to see this emergence where it is incredibly prevalent. And frankly, the reason that we see overdoses become so much more associated with fentanyl, it's because it's so much stronger. Fentanyl can be 50 to 100 times more, if not even more potent than heroin itself. And so if you're somebody who thinks that you are utilizing heroin, and then all of a sudden you have this other substance that is poisoning your illicit supply because there's no way to know, frankly, you think that you're being safe, and then all of a sudden you are overdosing and not knowing why. And this is what really led us into where we are now. And so fentanyl has continued to drive the overdoses associated with the opioid crisis over time. But as you're getting over here towards 2019, 2020, people are becoming aware of this, right? They're not dumb. People don't want to die when they're utilizing and addressing some of the issues associated with their substance use disorder. And so they're utilizing other substances, hopefully because they might be a little bit more safe. But unfortunately, what we now know is that fentanyl has infiltrated even other types of substances, including methamphetamine, powder cocaine, and crack cocaine. And so you have now, it's very uncommon to find substances that don't have the risk of some sort of fentanyl or potentially an overdose. One of the things that also is really important to note is that in Rich's story about Jonathan, so Jonathan was going through treatment. He was going through recovery processes. And when you do that, you think that you're fine, and that if you mess up once, that you'll be okay, right? Like if you go back and you start to use something at the same level that you used before, that you'll be okay to use that level because you build up a tolerance over time. Unfortunately, if you do that, it can send you into an acute overdose. It's essentially poisoning, right? And so if you go back and you utilize the same amount that you were using before you moved into recovery, you are likely to go into an overdose. And so those individuals in recovery, potentially early recovery, are at some of the highest potential for overdose death. And so that's why it's so incredibly important that we continue to connect people as they move through their recovery journey to those resources in their community, and that you are also aware of those issues in your home and in your household, and making sure that you have Narcan, naloxone or Narcan is now available over the counter. You can also get it from your single county authority. Most places are now giving it up for free across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So naloxone it comes in a nasal spray. It also comes in an injection, but most people get it as a nasal spray, and you can utilize that to help to reverse an overdose. Sometimes it might take more than one dosing, particularly if you are overdosing from fentanyl. So it's important to always have two. That's my rule of thumb, is making sure that you think about having 2 doses with you at all time, particularly if you are supporting somebody or supporting a loved one with a substance use, an opioid use disorder. Important to note is that it doesn't work on any other substances other than an opioid. It doesn't help with a stimulant. It doesn't help with an overdose associated with xylazine, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But it doesn't help with those things. It can only help with an overdose. But you should, no matter what, always call 911 as soon as you notice this, and then start to administer the fentanyl, the naloxone, because then that makes sure that those people who are trained with addressing issues of overdose, whether it's fentanyl or heroin or whatever, can get to you as soon as possible. So let's go on and talk about some other trends. So we've continued to see overdose deaths rise over time, unfortunately. More recently, we saw them rise very specifically during the COVID pandemic. We thought we were kind of turning the corner, but in 2020, 2021, 2022, national overdose deaths have risen. I'm going to give you a little bit of a precursor, though, preview that I have some good news to share with you all. But for now, just so that you're aware, I've mentioned that opioids are not necessarily the only thing that we need to worry about. It's because, as I mentioned before, we see an increase of prescription opioids in combination with synthetic opioids. So that is something that we're considerably watching over time. And you can see the prescription opioid painkillers, or it might be something along the lines of a combination of that and fentanyl or something like that, that's where the danger lies in all of this, when you're utilizing them in combinations with things. So, for example, heroin in combination with synthetic opioids has actually gone down because people are aware that heroin has been poisoned, right? But unfortunately, we don't see that necessarily occurring with everything. Benzodiazepines have fallen over time, but stimulants is really where we're concerned, and this includes powder cocaine, this includes crack cocaine, this includes methamphetamines, and so some people will utilize them in combination with one another intentionally. So you might utilize a stimulant in order to counter the effects of an opioid, which tends to slow you down, makes you very sleepy. A stimulant will wake you up and make sure that you don't have those severe effects. But if you keep doing that over time, it's going to catch up to you, and over time, it will cause you to have an acute overdose. And frankly, likely that's what's occurring in these increasing numbers over time. Antidepressants have really stayed about the same as far as overdose deaths. They haven't really risen. That's a good sign, frankly. But I mentioned before that I had a bit of good news, and what we're starting to see is that 2023 again might be our peak again. So I'm hoping that what we're seeing as far as trends go, that in early 2024, we're starting to see this downturn. These are just provisional data, so this comes from the CDC, but it shows us that in our more recent information and recent overdose deaths, that we're starting to curve the tide, and there's been some really great press about there talking about that we actually might be turning the tide on some of these things. And this is because people are becoming more aware, people are utilizing and accessing naloxone, and people are getting people into treatment hopefully faster and quicker, and making sure that they do so over time. And when we look at, again, so this is more good news for us, not necessarily good news for the western side of the state, so western side of the country. So the states in the blue are actually decreasing in overdose death rates between January 2023 to January 2024. So that's us. That includes Pennsylvania, that includes Ohio, that includes West Virginia. So we do see some good news that's going out, particularly over by you. It's the western side of the country that now, frankly, which has been not as nearly affected by the opioid crisis over time as bad as we had over here on the eastern side of the country, and particularly in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. When we start to think about some of the trends, not just nationally, but here in Pennsylvania over time, again, the good news is that in 2022, this is the most recent finalized data. 2023 is still provisional, so I'd like to make sure that we only use data that we are for sure that it is accurate. But in 2022, overdose deaths actually decreased, and that's compared to 2021. So that's good here in Pennsylvania. I also like to make sure that we're aware of who is passing away here in Pennsylvania. And frankly, every 2 hours, one Pennsylvania died from a drug overdose in 2022. Likely that increased in 2023 because we did see a slight increase. But almost 2/3 of people who passed away from an overdose death were male, and over half died at home. And so these are helping us to recognize that there might be some opportunities for us to hopefully monitor and make sure that people are being safe. And of these overdose deaths, 84.4% were still opioid related in Pennsylvania. So we continue to see this as something that is driven by opioids, and specifically fentanyl. So 78 of all of our overdose deaths involve some form of fentanyl in some way, shape, or form. But as I mentioned before, we saw 2022. We're starting to dip in 2023. Again, 2023. These are provisional data. I don't like to say that we are fully on a decline just quite yet, because this information is still early, because sometimes it takes a little bit for some of the toxicology reports to be officially done, and that can sometimes take even up to a year or so later. But the good news is we start to see a downward trend from 2021 to 2022, and likely maybe 2023. And when we look at these substances, we do see, again, opioids, fentanyl, but stimulants continues to be a concern. Any stimulant, but particularly cocaine, because it's really easy to poison cocaine with fentanyl. We also see this other substance called xylazine. So this is this is something that isn't necessarily as prevalent over on your side of the state. It's more over on the eastern side in Philadelphia, and it's made its way to the middle of the state and to other parts across the country. But xylazine is it's a tranquilizer utilized in veterinary medicine. And when utilized in combination with an opioid, it can cause issues of ulceration. So you might see some of these unfortunate and really horrific images where you might see people with open sores or open wounds, and those issues are due to the poisoning of these illicit drugs by xylazine. And again, this just shows you over time that any opioid has continued to be the leading factor in all of our overdose deaths here in Pennsylvania. And when we take a look at the overdose deaths that are occurring, unfortunately, we do see higher rates over down in the southeastern and the southwestern sides of the Commonwealth. There are other pockets throughout Erie, up in the northeastern side has some of the counties up there that are facing these issues, but really those are the two largest areas of issues. And so this is such an important bit of information for you all to be aware of, because the more that we're aware, the more that we can work together in order to address these issues. I mentioned before that men die of overdose more than women, and that's the case here in Pennsylvania, almost by a ratio of 2 to 1. We also are noticing that there's an increase in individuals who are of Hispanic origin, increasing their overdose death rates over time, unfortunately. So it's important that we recognize that this affects anybody from any background at any time. But we also note that those individuals who are from the Black community are increasing their rates of overdose faster than any other group, not just here in Pennsylvania, but frankly across the entire country. And so we want to make sure that we're reaching out to any individual that might have issues associated with substance use disorder, and particularly opioid use disorder, because we want to make sure that they can get into treatment as quickly as possible. We typically think of substance use and using drugs as kind of like a young person thing, but this has been very different. The opioid crisis has been very different from any other trend that we've ever seen. You'll note that unfortunately we see 35 to 44, 45 to 54. Those are the age groups that we see the overdose death rates at the highest. And frankly, we know that the opioid crisis has decreased the life expectancy, particularly of white men, over time, because it's hit that group so hard, and specifically in those later years of their lives. Because if you think about it intuitively, if you are somebody who became exposed to opioids through a prescription, particularly prescription opioid painkiller, and then drew your dependency on over time, it's probably somebody who had access to insurance, probably had some sort of a physical injury or some sort of physical work location. And so that's why we see in the rural areas where we see people typically with higher rates of insurance, people with higher rates of physically intensive jobs, that's where we saw lots of these prescription opioid painkillers being dispensed through their primary care physician in the very beginning. And that's what really fueled a lot of the dependence and a lot of the opioid crisis in the very beginning. And if you read some of those really wonderful books that are available to you through the library, you'll see that it is just that case. It's very similar to what Jonathan's case was. But that's not the only time that you get exposed. Sometimes it might be that you get exposed through recreational use. We know that people use drugs for a whole host of different reasons. Just because they use those substances and then it might develop a dependency and then might develop a substance use disorder doesn't mean that they're any less deserving of making sure that they get into treatment and stay alive, so that we can make sure that we live long, healthy, happy lives together, because those are our brothers, our sisters, our daughters, our friends, or frankly, our moms and our dads. And we want to make sure that no matter what, we get to see them live very happy lives now and into the future. And so that requires all of us to make sure that we're watching out for those warning signs and finding ways to get them into the health that they need. So in Washington County, again, we have good news for you all. So, you all spiked at the highest numbers of overdose deaths in 2016 at 102. Again, we saw another spike in 2020, 2021, but frankly, you're starting to see those numbers decline. Again, 2023 and 2024 are preliminary. So just note that these are not finalized numbers. However, we are seeing good trends, and that's a good sign. And I think that, frankly, it's because of the really wonderful work that's going on at the Single County Authority. But I'm also really aware that you have a really great coalition that works with your county level administrators, brings together people from across the entire county, from treatment to law enforcement to recovery support services to people at the Single County Authority. They work together to really think about how they can address these issues comprehensively across Washington County. And so I highly recommend that if you are interested in this, that you get involved with your county coalition. Again, here in Washington County, we see these trends are very similar to that of the rest of Pennsylvania. Men are more likely to die of an overdose death, and again, the age range is about the same as well. But we have seen the 25 to 34-year-olds, that group, along with the 35 to 44. So anywhere from 25 to 44, that's where the bulk and majority of the overdose deaths are occurring in Washington County. Like I said, it is not the 15 to 24-year-olds. This is something that you need to talk with your friends, your colleagues, your adult children, and sometimes even your parents around making sure that you are aware of some of the warning signs associated with opioid use and use dependencies, and then opioid use disorders. And much like the rest of the Commonwealth, fentanyl and opioids are leading overdose deaths. Stimulants are a close second, and methamphetamines are also in there as well, but not necessarily to the extent of cocaine and any other types of stimulants. So you will note that xylazine isn't necessarily as prevalent here in Washington County. I think that that's a good thing. But the more that you can be aware that those types of other types of substances that can get into your supply and cause issues, frankly, from either the Philadelphia range over or from Ohio in, because you are at that nexus, the more that we are aware that those substances can be poisoned, the better. And again, these are just the trends that are in Washington County over time. So with that, I'm going to take just a quick minute to take some questions. I saw some things that were poking up here in the chat. I'm going to run through those, but if you have any questions about any of that information, because that's a lot of data, that was a lot of trends, those are a lot of numbers. And I'm seeing that Brianne is also thanks so much for being on this, Brianne, because she's also saying that the Single County Authority also provides free Narcan training as well. So make sure that you find ways to reach out to them. And so she's also made sure that other people are aware of the resources that they provide in the county. So again, if you're interested in connecting with the Single County Authority, Brianne Pugh again has so graciously made sure that we have all this information right in the chat, and I'm sure that we can share that out later as well. Any questions in the room? Any questions others online that you all might have at this stage? Great. Well, I'm going to continue on so that we can make sure that we have some time for some discussion. So one of the things that you might be interested in. So overdose deaths are important, but there are other indicators that you might want to just be aware of, that you might be signaling that there's some issues. And so one of the things that I like to highlight, this is from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health across the entire United States. Again, substance use is something that occurs in roughly a quarter of all Americans. So 1 in 4 people use some sort of illicit drug, and this is probably underreported because this is through a survey. So you can imagine people don't always want to say I'm using drugs. So just know that this is something that it's not uncommon. And I think that previously when we were thinking about substances and substance use, that we thought like, no, this could never happen to me. This could never happen to my community. This could never happen to my friends. And unfortunately, we do know that this occurs, frankly, often. Cannabis, marijuana, is the most popularly used illicit drugs, followed by hallucinogens. And we still see that there are a lot of people who utilize pain reliever, prescription opioid painkillers, either recreationally or misuse them in some way, shape, or form. But cocaine, and then all the way down as you're starting to see heroin, again, is not used often. But the unfortunate part is that when you do use heroin, it might not be safe. And so there are ways to make sure that you can think and be aware of whether or not your illicit drugs are safe. One of them is through, they're called testing strips. There are testing strips for both fentanyl and xylazine. And what they do is they say whether or not that there's either xylazine or fentanyl present in that substance, and you should not use it. And this is a way, this is a way for us to make sure that those people who are active in their use can stay alive, so that we can get them into treatment and then get them into recovery for a long, healthy, happy life. That's the whole focus of utilizing these things. We're not encouraging use. We're trying to make sure that people who are using safely, so that they can get to the treatment that they need. And I think that there's also this misconception that people who misuse prescription opioid painkillers or might use heroin, that they automatically have some sort of substance use disorder. And that's not always the case. Only 5 of all these people that are utilizing prescription opioid painkillers, only 5, a little over 500,000 or so are utilizing with heroin. And then there's also a misconception that you're using all these drugs all together all the time, and that's also not the case. These are small amounts of people across the entire country. This is nationwide, that are utilizing and using substances in combination with one another. So just because you know that somebody is using something doesn't always mean that they're using everything. So that's also really important to be aware of. In the United States, roughly about 50-ish million or so people have some sort of substance use disorder. So that's quite a few. That's people aged 12 and older. So 17.3% of all Americans have this. Now, as I mentioned before, this is on a scale. It doesn't mean that everybody is in that crisis stage of a severe substance use disorder in what we might consider addiction. Some of those might be mild. Some of them might only be moderate. And actually, most of those people with some sort of use disorder are actually in that mild phase. And that's where we want to pay attention. Are they exhibiting some of these criteria, these warning signs that they might need some help? And if we get them into the treatment that they need at that stage, it is much more likely that they will then not continue forward in their moderate or potentially even severe substance use disorders into the future. So if you see something, say something, and say something fast. And again, of those people who might have a substance use disorder, only about 27.2 million have some sort of drug use disorder. That includes alcohol use disorder, those numbers previously. And only amongst about 2.2% of all Americans have some sort of opioid use disorder. So again, we see these large amounts of people passing away, and that's because these substances are so incredibly deadly. They are incredibly potent, and particularly if you do not know what you are using, that it becomes incredibly dangerous because they have been poisoned. Sometimes those substances have been poisoned. So the more that we can let people know that these substances that are illicit are not safe, and that there are options to get you into treatment, the faster it is that we can address these issues together. The other thing that I think is promising, though, is that we are starting to see declines in emergency room visits. This is across the entire country, across the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But this is this is just in Washington County itself. So we are starting to see people going to the emergency room less and less for an overdose in some way, shape, or form. And we are seeing that trend occur at about the same rate in Washington County as across the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So you all are matching some of those trends, and frankly, those trends are good, because that tells us that those non-fatal overdose deaths that might be occurring are not necessarily as prevalent. Also, this also tells us that there's likely Narcan that is available out in your community, so that people are not always having to go to the emergency room. But I'm hoping that they get access to treatment as fast as possible. So if you know people who are overdosing and utilizing Narcan, get them access to treatment. Other good news is that so beyond overdoses and beyond some of those statistics, we also monitor what's called youth use. And so it's the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, called colloquially the PAYS survey. And this is taken in high schools all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we're seeing, frankly, some good news. This generation, this very younger generation, are utilizing alcohol less and less. They're utilizing cannabis, marijuana less and less. And we're seeing them utilize substances and other types of drugs less and less overall. So you can see these both from lifetime use, but in the past 30 days, they're using less. And this is occurring between 2019 to 2023. So we're seeing these things as a good sign that hopefully some of the information that we're putting out there is working, particularly with our youth population, and some of that prevention work, that primary prevention that's going on in our school systems to help educate kids about using substances and the dangers of using, and developing skills to address this from an early age until, again, hopefully for the rest of their lives, that they can, frankly, utilize those skills to address and hopefully not utilize these substances, even though that they believe that their peers might. Because peer influence is one of those things that we know is the highest predictor of not just opioid use, but any substance use within youth populations. Again, these are just other trends associated with other substances. We actually see very little use of cocaine, crack, methamphetamines, and heroin across all of our youth populations, which again, these are good things. We want to make sure that we're seeing these. Same things with hallucinogens, ecstasy, Molly, synthetic drugs. So counter to some of those narratives that we hear that, oh, people are using drugs more, we're actually seeing that occurring less and less. There are some emerging things that I mentioned before that I want to help you understand a little bit more about, that you might have heard about, and I want to hopefully dispel some of those myths. First of all, this idea of counterfeit pills. So you've probably seen this image to the right. The press typically calls it rainbow fentanyl. Frankly, these are not something that are as common as you might think. It's these types of pills, these colors that look like candy, are actually fairly rare. What typically is occurring is that individuals are pressing pills to mimic and look like real pills. So when you think that you're purchasing an OxyContin from somebody, or you're purchasing a Percocet, you likely are not getting that. And in most cases, you're probably getting some sort of fentanyl or some sort of other synthetic opioid that is mixed into that. And you will never know the exact dosing because, frankly, the people who are making these pills are not trained to do so. And so that's the real danger here. Any type of pill that you receive from somebody else is something that is not safe. And it should be tested with fentanyl and other types of testing strips. There's these other things that are called nitazines. This is something that we're monitoring here in Pennsylvania, but we're also monitoring it across the entire country. So nitazines are another form of synthetic opioids, and they are frankly more potent than fentanyl. So we are seeing that this poisoning of our supply is only getting worse and getting more complex, right? Like it's not just fentanyl, it's not just these other things, but these things are infiltrating and getting into these supplies. So it's really important that people know that nothing is safe. Nothing that you use that comes from an illicit supply should be ever considered safe. Xylazine I've mentioned before. Much of the use and much of where we've seen it occurring is in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, across that eastern seaboard, and it has made its way into the country from the eastern side of the United States. So if you do hear about these things, just know that that is occurring. There are ways to test to make sure that xylazine is not present. That we have xylazine testing strips now, so make sure that that you're aware of those things. But again, this helps to see that again these substances are not safe. There are some other ones that are kind of popping up. This other sedative that's from veterinary sources, medetomidine. I never pronounce that. It's a very that is a substance that is coming into the supply. Captagon is another one. It's an amphetamine type stimulant, so it will look different. to somebody who's using, because it will make you'll see them thinking that they might not necessarily be going to sleep like what occurs with an opioid, but might be more of a stimulant. It might have lots of energy. And this is something that's commonly used in the Arabian Peninsula and is now making into the United States. There are also synthetic cannabinoids, synthetic cathinones, bath salts, phenylethanines, ecstasy, molly. All of those that we might have heard in the past, they're actually trending down. They're really quite uncommon. You might see synthetic cannabinoids here and there, but for the most part, most of these substances are much more less common than they have ever been before. And if you're curious about some of these emerging trends, there's this really great group called Pennsylvania Groundhogs. They go out and they test these substances from illicit supplies and see like where are these things spreading across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And you can go to their website and sign up for alerts if you're curious about making sure that you're aware of this in your community. So I'm going to pause one more time just to see if there are any questions before we go on to what it is that you can do. And so I saw something pop up here in the chat. So what Kathy has a question. What is the reason that high school kids are using substances less? That's a good question. Well, Kathy, one of the things that I'm hoping that we can point to is some of the really fabulous work associated with prevention that is going on across not just Pennsylvania, but frankly across the entire country. Pennsylvania has, and Washington County has done so, and there are really great sources of this through the Pennsylvania State University's EPIS Center, as well as Extension. They have developed primary youth prevention programming that is available in your communities, in your school systems, to make sure that kids, frankly, are more aware of the dangers associated with substance use, and building more than just danger and scaring kids. What we're doing now is we're helping them develop skills so that they can make sure that they can stand up to their friends if they are utilizing substances or getting that peer pressure, not just for drugs, but frankly for lots of other things. And so the way that we think about prevention and the way that we think about education, particularly for our kids these days, is much different than what it was even 10 to 12 years ago. It's been really great. The other thing, Kathy, is that frankly, it's becoming less of an interest of this newest generation. And frankly, we can't explain it all, but there are some signs that some of the things that we know in our society, so the awareness of the opioid crisis, the dangers associated with illicit substance use, that is helping to drive some of that awareness as well. But good question. Any other questions out there right now? Great. So let's talk about what it is that we can do together. So first of all, you're doing one of the first things that I recommend to, frankly, everybody. Educate yourself on what works. Educate yourself on the issue of substance use disorder. What does it really mean? What does it look like? What are some of the warning signs? And we've shared some of those things. But the other part of this is making sure that you think about not just investing in strategies to address this issue, but making sure that you're investing in strategies that we know have actual impact on the community. And this is what we call evidence-based practice. And so there's a whole bunch of criteria. This is very academic-y. I'm not going to get into it, but there are things that we know that are harmful and ineffective. And if we know that they are harmful and ineffective because we've evaluated them over time, we should stop doing them. One of the biggest pieces that I always let people know about is that we invest a lot of money in the DARE program for prevention, and there are much, much better and more effective ways of doing so. And the DARE program has been shown to actually increase use in youth populations. Whereas if you work with the Epicenter and Penn State, we have many, many other opportunities to work with our school systems to make sure that they are investing in programs that frankly work, and they are helping to reduce not just use, but they are keeping people alive by making sure that they don't use over time. And if you're interested in finding ways to make sure that you can connect with the Epicenter, that's that group that helps us to make sure that we're utilizing the best evidence-based prevention and intervention supports. This is their QR code, and I can always help you to connect to them as well. And if you're thinking about other types of evidence-based practices, the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, they have a whole resource center that is dedicated to this. And this includes everything from prevention to treatment, all the way into recovery support services. We also have this really great resource through Brandeis University. It's the Opioid Resource Connector. So if you and your county, you and your community, your town, your neighborhood want to find ways to bring in evidence-based practice, you can search for things that you are finding that is occurring in your community, find ways to match what's occurring to some of those ways to address them, and hopefully implement them right there in your local community. The other thing that is really important to really be thinking about is this concept of harm reduction. And they do a really great job of making sure that we think about harm reduction as a way for us to make sure that those people who are actively using right now, we can reduce their harms, get them into the treatment that they need so that they can, again, get into long-term recovery over time. We can only help to treat people who are alive. And that's one of the things that harm reduction does. One of the other thing that I consistently talk about, and Danielle alluded to this, is that I really want you to reconsider your perspective. You know, one of the things that I said I've had the opportunity to do, you know, in this work that I've done for nearly a little over a decade at this stage, is I get to hear people's stories associated with how substance use have affected their lives, and frankly, they're not always positive, but sometimes they are. We get to really hear about people who move into recovery, that they show that recovery is possible, that you can live really, really fulfilling lives once you move from treatment into that recovery stage of your lives. And it can be varied, like I mentioned before. Nobody's pathway is the same, but there are ways to help to make sure that we can capture your story and make sure that your story can help others. And so this is one of the things that you can do. So the Story Powered Initiative is dedicated to making sure that we think about our own perspectives differently by hearing about the stories of others. And we have lots of videos, we have lots of stories of people who have shared. And if you are at all interested in sharing your own story to help other people, this is a really great place to do so. I actually founded this work in conjunction with a whole host of partners across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we're continuing to make sure that we address stigma comprehensively through the Penn State University's Consortium on Substance Use and Addiction, as I mentioned before. And thankfully, we have somebody here who has insider knowledge. This was my number 3, connect with your single county authority, but also make sure that you're thinking about connecting with other local stakeholders. There's lots of really great information that comes from that single county authority because they have their finger on the pulse of the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They know about the resources from other communities, what's working, what they're working on. And then, you know, as I mentioned before, Washington County has a fabulous and really wonderful stakeholder group at the county level. Your single county authority can get you connected into there as well. Number 4 is being aware of those warning signs. So I shared with you before those signs and those diagnostic criteria associated with substance use disorders from the American Psychological Association. But the more that you can just be aware of some of those signs and helping to then talk about those warning signs with somebody, those can be really difficult and really hard conversations. So if you're not always able to do so, there are ways that you can maybe connect them to the resources that you are at least hopefully now more aware of, thanks to this presentation. But sometimes it is just simply asking them about how they're doing. Those early conversations can make sure that they can hopefully get into treatment, get into stem some of those issues that might be more advanced in a substance use disorder over time. Like I mentioned before, the earlier the better to get people in treatment so that they have the highest likelihood and the highest chance of making sure that they you know, recover from substance use disorder and addiction. And finally, it's okay to reach out for help. You know, one of the things that I think becomes very isolating is particularly if you are somebody who's helping with somebody with a substance use disorder, you might not always know all the answers, and you don't have to. There are really great people in your community. Like I said, the Single County Authority is a great group, but there are also not-for-profit organizations. There are treatment centers. There are coalitions, and frankly, you know, there are people who have been through this just like you. And so there are ways to make sure that you can continue to reach out. And you now know me, and I'm happy to be a resource for you now and into the future. So should you ever need any assistance, I'm happy to utilize my network to help you out as well. And so the best way to do, as I mentioned before, to get into contact with anyone at any time is 988. but here's my information. This is my email, and I'm sure that Danielle can make sure that you all have access to that. So feel free to be reaching out to me, because frankly, one of the, like I said before, Penn State University is meant to be a resource for all of us across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and beyond. And we're here to help, and we want to make sure that you have the access to the resources you need locally to make sure that anybody who you're supporting or any issues that you're facing in your community, they can be addressed together. So with that, I'm gonna pause. I'm going to stop sharing, and frankly, let's have a bit of a discussion. Happy to take any additional questions. Brianne, again, thanks so much for putting all this information into the chat. Really appreciate it. But Danielle, if there's any questions in the room, happy to take those now as well.
Glenn, I'm popping back in. First of all, I'm going to ask Lacey, she should be out there. We're going to stop the recording right now. That way, if anybody does have any questions and maybe don't want that to be recorded, we can do that. So we're just going to stop that right now. I do want to thank you so much. I mean, this was just